If you look at pictures like these and think, I want to do that, but wait, how do I do that?
I'm confused right now, G.
Don't worry, it's a lot easier than you think. So if this is your first time using pen or ink, there's really only a few concepts you have to understand. Number one would be understanding shading and lighting. You have to understand the subject you're trying to draw, and you'd have to understand what hatching actually is. When someone says hatching, all we're talking about is marks on a paper, really. I mean, you use those marks to portray some kind of shading or depth in your picture. What's really important, actually, is the space between the marks that you make. The closer together you make those marks, the darker your tones are going to be. When we talk about cross-hatching, all we're talking about is crossing those lines in order to create a darker tone. How you put those lines down or the direction of those lines really isn't that important when you're trying to express whether you have a light or a dark tone. What matters most is the space between the lines. Everything else is going to be up to your personal taste. I really like making something nice and clean, but something a bit more chaotic can really help convey a certain emotion in your picture. And once you have those basics down, you can start thinking more creatively about the shape of your line. You can change the variation and shape of your line to help portray the form that you're trying to draw. They don't even have to be lines, they can be any kind of mark that you want to make, as long as you understand that the space between those marks is the most important thing. And whenever I use pen and ink, I always start out with a sketch. I'm sure there's a lot of people that just go straight in with their pen. I am not that talented, and while I am usually proud of the finished product, I do know that I'll be making mistakes along the way. And using a pen just isn't as forgiving as using a pencil that you can easily erase. And in that sketch, I'll include as much detail as I can, and I'll block out as much shading as I can, just to make it much easier for that inking process. If you're thinking, okay, how do I know where I'm supposed to shade? How do I know where I put the light tones and the dark tones and everything in between? What always helped me was understanding how light works in the real world. I feel like all good art works because it does resemble reality in some way, shape, or form, even though that reality may be exaggerated. If you took a sphere and shine a light on it in a specific direction, the part of the sphere that's closest to the light source is always going to be the lightest, and the part that is furthest away will always be the darkest. And somewhere in the middle, you'll see a soft transition from that light to dark. Now, in most situations, there's going to be more than one light source, probably coming from a different direction, which, yes, will complicate things, but the principle of light will still remain the same, and you just have to make some adjustments to where you're going to put your shading. If we took a different object with a different shape, if the light was coming from a similar direction, where the light is and where the dark is will remain the same, but because of the flat surfaces, the light bounces off more directly, and you won't have that soft transition from light to dark. And this is why it's so important to understand the object that you're trying to draw. If you can understand the object that you're drawing, and you understand how light works, then I promise you shading will be so much easier. Before I start inking, I'll usually lightly erase everything with a kneaded eraser. Now this isn't completely necessary, I just find that it makes for a cleaner picture in the end, but you can just do whatever works for you. I tend to use a ton of different pens, but realistically, you really only need one. But if you can get your hand on a fine liner, something that has a really thin, fine tip, and then maybe something a bit thicker to help put nice, thick lines down, I would say those two things would be ideal. But by all means, use what you have at your disposal or what you can afford. Now, there's no set way to start in with your ink, but I think there are things you can do to make things easier. I usually start out with the outline, or at the very least, the outline of a certain section that I'm starting, and then I'll focus on the darkest parts of the picture. For me, when I figure out where the shadows are first, it automatically gives it a more three-dimensional look, and it just makes it a lot easier for me to establish where I want to go from there. And when I get into the more detailed shading, I always find it a lot easier to make my strokes from the darker parts to the lighter parts, rather than the other way around. I've always felt that the hardest part about shading a picture was figuring out how to make those transitions from the dark parts to the light parts. And to make things easier, I simplify all of the shapes that I find in my picture. I break them down into two categories: rounder, softer shapes, and flatter shapes. All of the rounder shapes I shade along the lines of a sphere, with softer transitions from light to dark, and with the flatter shapes I keep the differences in tone much more clear cut, keeping in mind what we talked about earlier about how light works on different objects. And I'm also changing the shape of the strokes that I'm making to help convey the form of each shape that I'm shading. The rounder objects have more rounded lines, and the flat objects have more straight lines. And I just continue the same process throughout each section of what I'm drawing. and this will be the foundation of the entire picture. And in my opinion, it's the most important part of your picture. If you get the foundation wrong, it doesn't really matter how cool the aesthetic of your picture is. It's always going to feel like it's missing something. So you really want to make sure you spend enough time on your sketch and the basic shading of your picture. Then you can move on to the fun stuff. No matter what you do, there will come a time that you're going to make a mistake with your pen. Whether your hand just slips or you drop your pen directly on the piece that you've been working so hard on, at some point you will have some errors that you have to correct. Now you could just use regular whiteout, but I really like using a white Posca marker. Why I like using the Posca so much is because it works just as good as whiteout, but you can be more precise with it, just like a pen. And you can also buy bigger ones so you can cover larger areas, and then when it dries, you can work right over it. But either way, I do recommend you have something to correct those mistakes that will eventually happen. Now, pictures like this that use a cleaner and more realistic style are probably what I enjoy drawing the most. Even though it seems like there's less detail than the previous picture, it actually took me a lot longer. One thing you'll notice is that when I do my shading in this picture, a lot of the lines are more parallel to each other. In fact, there isn't much cross-hatching at all. And that makes for a cleaner look. So I'm not just worrying about the shading and how correct I am with my shadows, I'm also paying attention to the overall aesthetic of the picture. And this just forces me to take more time. Now, even though it seems like there's not as many lines, there is a lot more precise detail. And to create the illusion of realism, I'm really using the shape of my line to help express more complex forms. And I'm also using a pen that has a very fine tip. And it's really helpful with minute details, and it also helps to create a wider range of tones, which will make my shading look a lot more realistic. So a picture like this may take more time or maybe a bit more mental focus, but to me, it's definitely worth it. So, in conclusion, I think if you break things down and simplify what you see, drawing a picture like this is a lot easier than you think. Well, that's going to be it for this video. I hope it was helpful. I hope you learned something. And if you like videos like this, please consider subscribing, leave a like. It really helps me out. Thank you very much. See you next time.